So I wanted to speak to you guys about practices because I get a lot of questions about what kind of practice do you recommend in terms of non-duality, non-dual inquiry, or just spiritual practices in general. And for a long time, I actually struggled to answer this question because I didn't know what practice I was actually taking part in. And it turns out that actually, I was taking part in a particular practice that I can now sort of isolate in my daily life and pinpoint. And I was doing it without even knowing I was doing it. And this is the beauty of desiring truth above all, above everything in life. You just practice spirituality in essence without knowing. And the beauty in that is also if you isolate time to tell yourself, hey, I'm going to do this, I'm going to meditate, it can become like a chore. It can become like this thing you have to do in order to get somewhere else. Whereas if there's the innate, honest, and sincere desire for truth, then that alone can actually be sufficient. It puts you in a place and optimizes you in some way where you are actually in constant spiritual practice. In other words, you can even go as far as to say that if you truly desire truth above everything else, you are in constant state of worship in some sense, in constant state of prayer in some sense. But really, I isolated this practice that I was doing without knowing, and I called it the OTO. And that stands for observing the obvious. And I called it that because it's exactly as the name suggests. What I try to do always, without even knowing I try to do it, is to just observe the obvious. When you wake up in the morning, depending on how your life or routine is arranged, personally, when I wake up in the morning, I get up, prepare myself, and either at the time go to university, go to school, or at the moment to wake up in the morning to go to work. And as you enter the school, the university, or the work, you interact with the people, and then you either go to the lectures or you are working on your projects or whatever the day entails. The meaty part of the day, the actual the sort of main chunk of the day, your attention goes towards trying to get stuck in between the details, trying to solve a problem, trying to interact with people, presenting to people. And as you get stuck in that sort of routine, what then happens is that just becomes everything. It just becomes the reality, or it just is the reality. Like there's all that's happening is people are speaking to you and you are speaking to people, and this problem that you're trying to solve in the grand scheme of things is like insignificant really, but it's made as though it's the biggest problem in the world so that there is this drive and motivation to try and solve it. And so even though that was happening, because I desired truth so much more than solving any other problem, be it something to do with work or university at the time, I would just take a step back and just, while these people are stressing out in the meetings about this project or whatever, I would just sit back and look at what's happening. Aside from the stressing out, like serious, like literally just look at what's happening. OTO, just observing the obvious. I'm sat here, we're on this floating ball of mud that is traveling at a tremendous speed in space. and the breath is moving, our heart is beating, there's this lump of flesh, bones, and as you take a step back, all these people speaking in the meeting, perhaps it's just a bunch of noises going around, and it's just it's observing the obvious. And this is something that you can only observe now, because it's really a now activity. It's something, the obvious is only in the moment. The obvious is only now. The obvious can't be in the past. The obvious can't be in the future. It just becomes ideas at that point. The obvious can only be now. And the obvious is that you are here. And so you may come back home and now it's quiet and you are in your room, let's say, and you look around and you see all this equipment. You see a pillow. You see, and you look at this pillow, right? This pillow is observed, and in some sense, you know you are observing the obvious when it becomes impersonal. There's no linked judgment or opinion about it. It's a pillow. How has it been used? How is it being used? It's a pillow. It can provide comfort in some way. It can adjust or allow the body to rest in a comfortable position. Okay? And really the main essence about this, or in observing the obvious, is that it's actually not really a doing activity, because observation is something that takes place regardless of opinion. So in order for you to even have an opinion about this pillow, you need to have observed it. It needs to be observed in order for an opinion or a judgment to be generated about this pillow. But really, we are just observing. And as you observe, it becomes obvious, or it becomes immediately apparent how obvious the situation is, beyond the complexities of the opinions and the judgments. I really hope that I'm doing a good job trying to explain this. And the same goes for when I would go out and take a walk. I would step out, take a walk, step by step, walking through a park. And that's all that is happening. There is no need to do more than the activity itself. Walking is just taking place. No one is doing the walking. Walking is just obviously taking place. And that's what's observed in that moment. And then the trees. There is a leaf. And really you can truly observe the obvious if there is the sincerity and honesty to admit that observing the obvious is actually superior to whatever opinions and judgments and speculations might arise. Because like I said earlier, in order for you to even begin judging the pillow, it needs to be observed. And so this is why observing, or observation in its most purest form, prior to the judgment, is superior, has a higher level of conviction, and is what I could refer to as obvious. Because what makes things not so obvious or ambiguous and biased and personal is what follows after the immediate observation of the object or activity or whatever is observed. And so this is really something that I'd encourage you to allow to take place. We are sat here, there is speech, and what is called speech is just a bunch of noises that are somehow making sense in the mind as the noises are heard. And these noises seem to be random, but when looked at in a different way, can seem orderly and repetitive and somehow express some sort of understanding. And whilst that is happening, there is seeing, there is hearing. And and if I was to sit with someone who's perhaps a researcher, an intellectual or something, they might turn around and I don't know why I'm saying researcher, intellectual, anyone really. They might turn around and say, duh, like obviously this is happening. And that's why I call it observing the obvious. And of course it's happening. Of course it's obvious for a reason. It's obvious, but we are allowing ourselves to observe the obvious regardless of the opinion of the obvious. And really is to stop overlooking it. It's to stop judging it, and is to also stop undermining it in some way. Because all life really is the obvious, is the ordinary that is already observed. And then the whole complexity of and the regurgitation or the expression of the opinions and the judgments comes after the observation. And that is just so much. And it's unneeded. 99% of the time is actually unneeded for any given time. So when I'm walking in the park, or anyone's walking in the park, and that's what you are doing, why do you need to think about so much? Why does there constantly need to be a movement of thoughts and expression, and stop trying to impose on what is being observed? Allow what is observed to just be. And the difficulty in allowing what you observe to just be is that it becomes so obvious what it is. And it's like, yeah, obviously this is the case. And so that is somewhat a justification as to why we should impose a complexity on what is observed. So, OTO, observing the obvious. It's incredibly liberating and freeing. And so, if you decide to do this, the longer you do this, the simpler everything just reveals itself to you. The simpler the way things actually, you realize how simple things really are. And you begin to see things for what they are. Thank you so much for watching. This is Hassan from the Spiritual Walks, and we are all on a journey towards the truth.